Well, I'm going to kick us off here. I'm going to have about 4 slides of overview, and then I'm going to turn it over to the speaker tonight, Greg, who can introduce himself and will walk us through his review of 2020 in terms of product management and review. So again, we're incredibly grateful for you to be here with us this evening. At BPMA, we're really about 3 things. We're about helping you as product managers level up your skills through a series of events, workshops, and mentorship, helping you grow in your career today. We're also here to help you network, understand other product managers in the regional area here, as well as within your domain. So if you're in healthcare, interacting and engaging with other healthcare product managers. And lastly, we're about landing you new jobs. So whether that's, again, through the mentorship program and understand what it takes to get to the next level, whether it's learning how to apply various skills, or whether it's engaging with your colleagues here to understand about new opportunities. We don't do this alone. We do this with a number of our sister organizations through Boston Product Camp, through Women in Product, and Agile Project Open. So BPMA with their sister organizations really helps to serve the regional and Boston product management community here. And in addition to BPMA and the sister organizations, we of course could not put any of this on without our sponsors. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our partners and sponsors for their willingness to partner with us to put on this great content for the community here. So before I go further, I'll pause for a minute to see if there's any sponsors or partners on the call now that want to speak on behalf of their organization to the attendees here. Excellent. Well, we'll keep moving here. I encourage you to look up all of these organizations that can help you level up your skills and find new opportunities, very much intertwined with the mission of BPMA. And lastly, before we jump into tonight's event, I want to encourage you to look at our Eventbrite or our website at bostonproducts.org to get plugged into next month's event, where what are the nuances of being a product manager for an internal application? Lastly, I just put in the chat some of the different resources that BPMA has available, whether it's the mentorship program, the job board, or the how to sign up for the newsletter. So I encourage you to go there, click on those links, get plugged into the local community here. And with that, if there isn't anything else, I'll turn it over to Greg.
All right, thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. Share my screen.
We can see Zoom.
Okay. I think that's, let me try that again. I didn't end up with what I was aiming for. There we go.
We can see the PowerPoint.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Michael. All right, first of all, great to be here again. Thank you for the opportunity to share our most recent findings. Also want to take a second to thank both Steve and Michael for making today's presentation possible. Thanks, guys. So a little, just by way of background, a little information about myself and my company, Actuation Consulting. We lend a helping hand to organizations looking to build out or scale a product management organization. We're also a global provider of product management consulting services, and we also provide product management training to companies worldwide. I'm the author of 2 books, both of which are reflected here in the field of product management. And I've also listed out to some of our recent clients as well in the fintech, healthcare, and consumer product spaces. In terms of today's presentation, the webinar breaks into 3 main sections. The first has to do with about the respondents or demographics. So we'll get to know a little bit about the people that responded to the survey, our annual survey. Additionally, we'll take a look at the section around performance, where we'll examine both product team performance from what respondents told us about their product teams, product management, as well as innovation. And finally, we'll review the regression analysis findings from this year's study. It's worth noting that our survey data is collected, without blindly, I guess is the way to say it. People have the opportunity to provide contact information, but they can remain completely blind. And then we provide the data to an independent statistician to conduct regression analysis. And the resulting findings are at the end of today's presentation. So a little first about survey method. Our sponsors and promotional partners are emailed a web-based survey every year. And basically it's anonymous, as I mentioned earlier. Those we're interested in hearing from those in the following roles and a few more that aren't listed here, but from business analysts to development managers and engineers, product, program, and project managers, as well as product owners, user experience, QA folks. So just everyone who's actively involved in the product development process in any way are the folks that we want to talk to. So who responded to this year's survey? Well, as in prior years, the vast majority of respondents do play an active role in creating or enhancing products and services within their organizations. This year's 97% rate is comparable to prior years. And I think what is different this year, which probably began to be heartening to this group, is that the vast majority of respondents actually, we had a higher concentration in the product managers and product owners than we normally do, over 54%. So for any of you who may have responded to this year's survey, a big thank you. In terms of reporting title, when asked who they report to, respondents were pretty evenly spread across all categories. We had a good distribution across all segments. In all, 77% of respondents reported to either a company officer, a VP, or a director. In terms of primary business focus, as in the past, this is very consistent with previous studies. Over half of respondents come from the technology segment. Our definition of technology includes both hardware and software. In fact, over 51% of respondents came from the technology sector, and the remaining 49% is spread across the other segments. As you can see, 18% in services, 12.1% for consumer products, 12.1% in other, so anyone who didn't identify with any of these categories, 4.8% for education, and 1.8% for government. And finally, as it relates to company size, we once again had a good representation across all segments, with a higher concentration in businesses between 50 million to 2 billion in annualized sales. And in fact, that segment represents roughly 45% of the total responses. All right, now let's take a closer look at what product team members told us about their organization's performance. In terms of stability of the product team, the majority of respondents, 40%, indicate that their teams are intentionally stable over the long term. Conversely, only about 15% of teams indicate that they're intentionally fluid. From our perspective as a consulting organization, we see significant benefits to keeping product teams stable, such as teams being able to maintain momentum and accumulating knowledge about their products over time. However, we recognize not all organizations have the staffing to utilize or maintain this model over time. In terms of trust, communication, and collaboration, there's some good news. In fact, 71% of product teams are currently reporting strong cohesion. However, 29% of respondents tell us that they have very low levels of trust, communication, and collaboration. And that's a pretty significant number of organizations. So there's plenty of room for improvement on this front. The way that, so when we ask the question, which of the following methodologies best describes the way your organization develops products, as you can see by this graph, agile methodologies continue to be the most popular and frequently used. This is closely followed by blended methodologies at around 39%. And we've been tracking product development methodology adoption since back in 2012. So I'm going to share a longitudinal look at the data so that we can take a look and see how things have changed over the years. So if we start by looking at the bar on the far left, which represents 2012, you'll see that Agile Scrum was just 12.8% at that point in time. By contrast, if you look recently, as today, it's nearly 50%. Notice also that waterfall in pink has continued to decrease from 18% back in 2012 to almost 9% today, and it has been experiencing a steady decline over time. Finally, blended methodologies have slowly stabilized at roughly 40% as Agile methodology adoption has continued to grow. Back in 2012, about 53% of organizations said they were using a blended methodology. So it's interesting to look over time and see how these methods have tended to grow or ebb. Well, we get a lot of questions from folks asking whether they think waterfall will actually fade away. But the truth is, from our perspective, that these methodologies are a bit like arrows in a quiver. You select hopefully the method that best suits your purpose, and there's always going to be a role for Agile, probably in regulated industries such as pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and others, where there's a high degree of necessary documentation and regulatory guidelines. So, from our perspective, Agile won't completely kill waterfall. It'll be around. So when asked which methodology is associated with increasing the profitability of your product, as in prior years, Agile is the method that respondents associate with increased product profitability. If you compare the findings this year's findings to 2016's findings, looking longitudinally, which was the last time we asked this question, the response rate is quite consistent at about 52.1%. So there hasn't been much change since 2016 in these numbers. When we asked about the effectiveness of respondents' product teams, they basically told us that roughly less than 1/3, or about 31.5% of teams, say that they deliver value consistently. The majority, about 51%, say they deliver value but lack consistency in execution. And approximately 18% confess that they perform poorly, which is a pretty significant number of organizations. So there continues to be plenty of room for improvement here. So let's transition to what respondents told us about product management. The first question we asked is, where do product managers come from? How did you enter the field of product management? And for those of you who may not be product managers on this call, but aspire to be product managers, there's really good news. Product management is an equal opportunity profession. 33% of product managers are entering the field from an engineering role based on our data. Only 10% of respondents started as product managers. And marketing at 11%, ops at 10%, both sales and customer service at 9% respectively, also provide excellent gateways to becoming a product manager. Other makes up the difference. I think the bottom line here, though, in the data is that product management truly is an equal opportunity profession, although statistically speaking, engineers have the best opportunity to enter the field of product management. Let's take a closer look at how time utilization by product managers and what respondents told us about that. When it comes to how product managers use their time, there appears to be significant room for improvement. Just 36% of product managers spend the majority of their time achieving company business goals. Sadly, only 64% of product managers are, 64% of product managers are unable to spend sufficient time focusing on company objectives. Does this shock anybody? When asked about commonly utilized requirement criteria, there were quite a few responses grouped closely together. So I'll walk through them quickly. I want to place a marker on both development cost and profitability, though, because that will come back up in the regression analysis a little bit later. So if you can keep those numbers in your mind, I'll remind you later when we get to that section. But the number one prioritization criteria that respondents told us they were utilizing is size and influence of customer. The second had to do with risk, which we defined as technical, market, or product risk. The third has to do with development cost. The fourth is with key internal stakeholder influence. The fifth is technical, which represents both architecture, stability, and scalability. And then you notice that revenue rounds out the number 6 spot at about 49%. And then there's a big drop off to profitability at about 39%. So we'll talk a little bit more about profitability and development cost a little bit later in the regression analysis. In terms of roadmap transparency, the numbers you see on this slide are roughly the same as the last time we asked this question back in 2016. So once again, very little change. The only change of note is that there were fewer responses of roadmaps with a 3-month time horizon. The question we asked about product line reviews is in fact quite self-explanatory for the most part, but let me just give it a quick voiceover. Roughly 75% of companies regularly or occasionally conduct product reviews. Only 17.6 say they never do a product review, and 7% of respondents weren't sure whether their organizations were conducting them or not. All right, let's take a closer look at what respondents told us about their innovation practices. When asked about how actively product managers are in the innovation process, how actively involved they are in the innovation process, we were really heartened to see that about 65% of respondents indicated that product managers are actively involved in these activities within their organizations. We view this as great news. Historically, we haven't had that type of response. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it was significantly less the last time we asked the question. In terms of innovation maturity, or it might be actually more appropriate to say innovation immaturity, respondents tell us that most organizations, 61%, have immature innovation processes. Generally, innovation maturity is lacking, with only about 16% of organizations indicating that their innovation processes are either optimized or well managed. When it comes to innovation program management, and we take a closer look at how these companies are managing their innovation programs, we can see that only about a quarter, or I should say a quarter of companies have automated their innovation processes. Over 3/4 of respondents indicate that their organizations are using manual spreadsheets or tools like SharePoint to manage their innovation programs. There's pretty significant room for improvement in this area as well. In terms of who's involved with innovation, the vast majority of organizations are relying heavily upon employees and then customers to spark innovation. Few organizations are relying upon suppliers and partners, startups, university, and researchers, or the public at large. And in terms of desired outcomes, there's quite a few different responses that were generated. I think we'll focus in maybe on the top 4. So the top 4 that respondents were largely utilizing in terms of the desired outcomes that they were seeking in their innovation processes were to gain and maintain competitive advantage at almost 70%, pretty significant number, new product and service development at about 67%, improved customer satisfaction at about 63%, and then continuous improvement at around 63%. And then there's a whole range of other outcomes that they're seeking, but they fall off pretty steadily down the bar chart. So let's take a closer look at this year's regression analysis findings, and let me just quickly run through them at a high level. First had to do with business strategy. The second had to do with the utilization of customer satisfaction as a metric for measuring product team performance. The third had to do with rethinking how product managers utilize their time. And the fourth has to do with profitability as a requirements criteria. So our regression analysis showed this year that a product team's ability to connect their daily activities to their company's overarching business strategy is highly correlated with financial success. However, only 27% of survey respondents this year indicated that their product team is able to connect their daily activities to the company's business strategy. Most respondents indicate that their organizations either fail to effectively communicate their company strategy to the product teams or indicate that the company is lacking a business strategy overall. And when looked at from a longitudinal perspective over the course of the last 7 years, the story is even more discouraging. The amount of product teams that can connect their daily activities to their company's strategy actually decreased by 10 percentage points, which we view as pretty bad and tragic, actually. Looking forward, though, I think companies that want to improve their performance of their product teams and their financial performance should shore up both communication and transparency regarding the overarching company strategy and how product teams are connecting to it. Doing so should have several benefits. It should help Product teams make better short and long-term decisions and lead to a clear understanding of the strategic priorities and how product team members' actions can positively or negatively influence outcomes. It's also likely to increase product team members' commitment to their work efforts. If any of you have ever been on a team, talented team members, you might have had on your team that often dislike working on projects that don't appear to add value to their organizations. It's very discouraging to be on a team like that. A lot of engineers hate to do like bug triage because they don't view that as meaningful to the code. So, regardless of whether you're an engineer or a product manager, the more that you can connect yourself to, the work that you do, the more satisfaction there will be. But understanding the context is a big part of that. So it really shows up as a pretty significant factor in this year's regression analysis. The second factor has to do with the utilization of customer satisfaction as a metric. And once again, we got some good news on this front, I guess. So in our view, product teams should be held accountable for their performance. However, when we first asked this question about what metrics product teams were being held accountable to, there was a wide range of responses, but not a single metric that organizations consistently held product teams accountable to. And that was way back in 2015. This year, our regression analysis shows that customer satisfaction is now the dominant metric that most product teams are being held accountable to. In fact, 51% of organizations are now using this accountability metric. Other metrics product teams are being held accountable to are listed here in descending order, such as quality, velocity or throughput, profitability, top line revenue, not being held accountable to any metric, and then market share and I don't know. I think the best news in all of this is that product teams that are held accountable to customer satisfaction were highly correlated in the data with improved performance. Additionally, this trend using customer satisfaction as the accountability metric for product teams has risen 10% since 2015. So that's a positive development on this front. As it relates to how product managers spend their time, once again, we're currently in an environment where the coronavirus has affected, the way that product managers can engage and they have to do so remotely nowadays. We'll get to this in a little while, but we are doing a current pandemic edition study where we're looking at actually what the impact of all these things are to product teams that we should release in the next 30 days. And one of the things that is really telling in the responses from the survey respondents is that, that the number one thing that's been impacted in their product development process has been the front end connection to customers and their ability to be able to engage effectively with them and in quantity. So we'll have more data to share on that shortly, but this data reflects pre-pandemic. The pandemic was just starting to hit when the survey closed out. So this data reflects sort of the earlier phase. So we should have a compare and contrast when the next white paper comes out in the next 30 days. But let's focus a little bit on what the data did say about how product managers spend their time, because I think this is directly applicable not only to that period of time, but what happens once we get past the pandemic. So what we found, though, was that how product managers spend their time really matters in the data. Companies that were encouraging their product managers to spend more than 30% of their time in the field were highly correlated with higher levels of success. Unfortunately, as you can see in the slide, only a minority of organizations, 11%, appear to enable their product managers to spend this much time in the field, for example, with customers and prospects at trade shows, et cetera. From our perspective, looking at the data, as the team that pulls it all together, there's a variety of reasons that we believe drive this. One of them has to do with lack of executive support. I don't think there's any question that it's pretty expensive to have your product managers actively engaged outside the organization 30% of the time at this level. And it does require strong support from the leadership team, not just the CEO, but the head of sales, finance, and others. And that doesn't happen as much as it should. Additionally, product managers themselves, and I'm sure many people on this call will relate to this, own up to their own shortcomings when it comes to time management, reactive behavior, and their own biases, for instance, skewing tactical or strategic. So, sometimes we can be our own worst enemies in terms of the way that we utilize our time. But regardless of the source of the current limitations on how product managers spend their time, organizations really need to rethink how they utilize their product managers and work to optimize external engagement. The regression analysis clearly shows that product managers who spend 30% or more of their time engaging externally leads to improved performance for both the product team and the organization. And finally, as it comes down to our fourth factor, we're getting at requirements prioritization and the role that profitability should play in it. Our latest regression analysis once again shows that emphasizing profitability as the primary criterion in the requirements prioritization process positively impacts performance. Unfortunately, only 39%, as we can see, of organizations actually use profitability as a requirements criterion. In fact, the leading requirements, which we went through a little bit earlier, starting with size of customer and then, going down to profitability, it shows that, the majority of people are focusing on other criteria mechanisms and less so on the profitability side, because profitability is the most commonly used prioritization metric. It's also worth noting that the reliance upon development cost, as I mentioned earlier, as a requirements criterion, we found to be negatively correlated with high performance in past studies. I think if we had to boil it down to a nutshell, more organizations need to embrace profitability as a metric, not the sole metric, but it should be a primary or at least included in the mix if they want to improve their product team's performance. So those are this year's 4 regression analysis factors. So let me shift gears for a second. If anyone's interested in getting a copy of this white paper, which has all this information and more, for those of you who might have been trying to capture this in written format, you can either reach out to me and I'll give you my contact information at the end of the presentation, or you can go to actuationconsulting.com and download a free copy of the survey or the white paper for yourself. Also, looking ahead, we have our new pandemic edition, which will be released shortly. And as I mentioned earlier, it has a lot of really good information. One of the things that came out of it that I'm happy to share as sort of a teaser is that a lot of the survey respondents are of the opinion that organizations need to redesign to be remote first. I think a lot of organizations are thinking about, and I think it's more likely that what we're going to end up with is a hybrid model where more employees spend more time at home, but come in for collaboration related kind of activities. But it's interesting that the survey respondents to the pandemic edition were like almost unanimous. 80% of them are really of the belief that their organizations need to re-engineer themselves, to think of themselves as remote first, and then in-house collaboratory second, if you will. So that's going to have some, I think, major impacts on sort of how organizations react going forward post-pandemic. As I said, our projection is really we're looking at a hybrid environment, but there's a belief by employees that it should be more than that, and that the retooling shouldn't just be employees being remote, but a lot of these processes not necessarily having to be carried out in-house. And a lot of redundancy in supply chain as well. So anyway, there's a lot more in the white paper that'll be coming out on this topic. It's probably one of the number 1 or 2 findings that we just discovered as we went through this last survey. We're still hashing out the final white paper, and it should be released in the next 30 days. I'd like to also do a shout out to our sponsor, Planbox, who for multiple years has been our primary sponsor of the study. They provide all the resources for us to conduct our research. Also, a big strategic partner with PDMA, who we work with very closely, as well as the Software and Information Industry Association, who's been with us for like the whole length of the study. We work closely with the Silicon Valley Code Camp, a lot of the engineering community in Silicon Valley, as well as the Chicago Product Management Association. And just a bit of recognition for the 3 co-authors. Each one of these gentlemen are part of the team, and they represent a different functional area. For example, Ron is a floating CTO. Steve is heavily involved with project management, and Matt is an operations person. So they each add their own unique perspective to each year's survey. As mentioned earlier, I'm putting up my contact information. If anybody wants to get on the list for the upcoming pandemic edition, feel free to please reach out to me, and I'll make sure that once it's released, you get a copy of it. And if anybody wants to download the current white paper, either go to our website or you can reach out to me directly, and I'll be happy to help you. And with that, let me turn it back to Michael and Steve. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Greg. I hope everyone found that incredibly helpful. We're going to now turn it over to a Q&A session. So I'd love for folks to feel free to come off mute, ask Greg a question, and we'll go from there. So moving to the interactive part of the presentation, we'll follow that with a breakout room session of just general networking. So to start, if you have questions for Greg about any of the content, feel free to come off mute and ask away.
Thank you, Greg, for this great presentation. My name is Lori Riley. I'm a product manager. I'm intrigued about what you mentioned about trying to make decisions based more on profitability. And I'm wondering, are there frameworks or tools, or what would you kind of recommend for someone to get started to kind of even quantify, you know, the costs and how to even like break that down in a large organization?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that is the number one thing that actually holds people back from utilizing profitability. We didn't dive into the mechanics of organizations that were actually utilizing profitability, you know, as a criterion to get a better understanding of that. So I don't really have a lot of helpful information that I can provide you. To be honest, this was just something that we recently discovered, and we do intend to actually do a little more due diligence on this, but we actually haven't had the time. The pandemic really impacted our ability to do this, to be quite honest. So I wish I had more information, you know, helpful information about how to approach this. But if you'd like, what I can do, if you want to send me an email as we start to do a little bit more due diligence in this area, I'd be happy to share any findings, Lori, that we come up with, you know, as we investigate this. It's probably going to be several months though, because everybody's so pinned down with the pandemic right now that I don't think we're going to be in a position where we can actually do that research probably till mid-year. So I just want to be transparent about that.
Sure. No, thank you very much. I will send you my email.
Okay. Thank you, Lori.
Hey, Greg, this is Scott. I'll jump in with a question. So another area that's of great interest would be different types of sort of development and specification tools. So for example, jobs to be done, design thinking, you know, lean startup type stuff, et cetera. Do you have any insights on that, or have you looked into that, or do you have any plans on looking at how those different frameworks and tools are being used?
We have not, but I tell you what, Scott, you know, a lot of the questions that we actually generate each year in these white papers, you know, like when the survey tools are based on people. For example, the one asks around product profitability and the perception of that. And we also ask a question about, you know, whether companies were financially profitable in any given year that we utilize as part of the background demographic information. These kind of questions were actually submitted by, I can actually remember the first one on the financial one was submitted by somebody at the Orange County Product Management Organization, and it became a question that we asked for years now. So if you want to send me a question, you know, frame the question that you think might be good for inclusion in the survey, and you want to send it over to me, I will actually push that. We keep a running list as we go and do these presentations, and we evaluate them, you know, each year. So I'd be happy to actually inject that in the mix and see if the co-authors can coalesce around it, and maybe we can insert it into an upcoming survey for you.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I mean, because that's definitely a growing area of interest in the field.
Yeah, I can't say that we've actually done that research yet. So, you know, it's something that I think we could look at in an upcoming survey.
Yeah, and I think tying it to the profitability question, because I mean, ultimately that's the real measure of whether you're succeeding, right?
Right, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. So I'll definitely reach out. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott.
Hey, Greg. So I have a question. I thought it was really interesting that customer satisfaction was the top, like the top way the teams are being measured, as opposed to, like, for example, revenue growth. Can you comment more on that, like in terms of where revenue growth fits into things?
Yeah,
I mean, I realize it's not high, but just your take on why.
yeah. I mean, I think what's happening is that customer satisfaction is something that organizations are actually measuring. And as such, the product teams appear to be, rallying around that as a standard. Our organizations are rallying around that as a standard. A lot of times measuring product team success is somewhat nebulous. And I think organizations struggle with that. So it seems like over the course of the last couple of years, they've really gleaned on the customer satisfaction as a metric. And I think organizations, conduct surveys about customer satisfaction and have been doing so for years. It seems to be something that the organization understands and finds value in, and it just seems to have become the default mechanism with which product teams. If we were to look back, Steve, like 5 years in the past, the number one response is our product team is not being measured at all. So, the evolution, I think, is to what's easiest as opposed to what might be the most valuable. I'm not going to say that this is the final stopping point in the evolution of what teams get measured by, but it seems to be the lower bar threshold that organizations can sort of rally around, and that there seems to be some understanding about across the breadth of the organization. Whereas I think things like revenue require a little bit more due diligence and discipline. You know what I mean? And maybe difficult for organizations to adopt that. I personally believe that's an excellent criterion. But, to be quite honest, I think organizations are going to have to evolve to that. And at least we're seeing progress in measurement over time. I guess that's the good news. So.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Welcome.
Hey, Greg. My name is Mo Zhu. I'm a product manager at Simply Safe. I'm wondering, on the slide about the percent of time product managers are spending out in the field.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is there I guess how literally is out in the field, right? There's sort of figurative, and also with the pandemic, or even if you're like a software product manager, you could be showing designs over Zoom or something like that, even without a pandemic. So right. I'm guessing that their definition there. And then the second thing about that I was wondering, as you mentioned, it's related to high performing product teams, the more time that you're spending out in the field. And I apologize if I missed this previously, but I'm wondering what is the high performance there, and what you think the relationship there is more, if you could dive into that.
Okay, I may have to come back to you for clarity on that one, but let me answer the first question first. So as it relates to time in the field, the way that we constructed the study, the specific answer is about literally time in the field, spending time with customers, trade shows. Once again, this was somewhat pre-pandemic. As I said earlier, the survey was just closing out when the pandemic was really kicking into gear. So what's represented there is physically actually meeting with customers and, trade shows, things along those lines. That's what was envisioned. Now, the second part of your question, do you mind rephrasing it again? I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
Yeah. So you mentioned that more time spent in the field is related to higher team performance, and so was that higher customer satisfaction or revenue growth, or some kind of metric, or how did you kind of get that relationship there?
Yeah, that came through the regression analysis. So unfortunately, I am not an expert on regression analysis. I'm like the furthest from it. That's why we hire an outside statistician to do it. I have to be frank about that. But so, basically the criteria that I know, well, I really can't speak to this. What I would say is that the things that we look at, either, from a regression analysis outcome standpoint, either end up being related to improved performance, meaning that the organization has achieved its objectives in the macro question or financially. And I believe that the one related to product, the product managers checked both the financial as well as the product team, improved performance, higher levels of performance as self-reported by, the survey respondents. So it clicked both those boxes.
Thank you.
But the actual regression analysis, I can't answer, unfortunately. I'm not good at that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Greg, I had a question
Sure.
about the methodology adoption rate slide.
Yeah.
Did you guys see any other trends beyond just the adoption rates? Like, is it more regional, or are there any kind of other aspects involved in that?
Well, so the answer, Rachel, is yes and no. So we have collected the data so that we could actually parse that out. But that's only for those respondents who actually self-identify, both, like geographic location and things. Like, not everybody does, because the study can be completely blind. Probably about 60% of people voluntarily enter their information because they want to participate either in getting a copy of the survey, the white paper that's produced, or they want to participate in future surveys because they found it valuable. The other percent of the population, don't provide us with information. So, we have all that data, but we've never actually gone in and looked at it at a regional level.
That makes sense.
Yeah, our goal had been, really, we've been fascinated by the evolution, the ebbs and flows of the different methodologies over time. And in fact, as an editorial comment, we used to look at things such as lean and other methodologies like XP, other agile methodologies like XP. We used to be more specific, Scrum, XP, other various methodologies. But over time, it became clear to us that the percentage of people that were using lean was so small that it became somewhat insignificant in the stack bars. So we eventually dropped it because after a couple of years of reporting, it just didn't seem to make much of a difference. So we sort of settled in on looking at the major methodologies and what their impacts, their ebbs and flows have been over time. It's pretty fascinating, actually. I don't know that anybody else has been tracking it, but we like to keep an eye on what's going on with trends. So.
I know I appreciate that y'all do.
Thanks, Rachel.
Any other questions for Greg? And if you can't come off mute for whatever reason, please feel free to put them into the chat and I can verbalize them here.
Hi, Greg. This is Gail Schlansky, and I'm a career product manager. So been in the industry in software for a long time. I have a question. You, in one of the slides, you talked about the innovation stuff, and I get involved, fortunately, in a lot of innovation. You talked about innovation management software. And I was curious if you had any particular favorites, or do you hear of any particular?
Good question. I don't. I do have one thing that since you asked a question, I will be shocked by my sponsor if I didn't point out that Planbox has innovation-related software. So we really don't have a particular favorite, Gail, one way or the other. We don't advocate for vendors specifically. We do due diligence on, for organizations, but that's proprietary for them. So I don't really have much I can say on this front, but we don't really have a bias. But there are plenty of great automation tools out there, and Planbox might be a good place for you to at least start to look.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome, Gail.
Okay, looks like nothing's coming through the chat here. So I'm just going to put in the chat a event feedback link. Feel free to click on that and give BPMA some feedback on how we can make events better for you all. At this point in time, I'm going to shift to just general networking with your colleagues. What I'm going to do is do breakout rooms of about 8 or so people. So feel free to stick around and engage with your fellow product managers. And please join me in thanking Greg for the time this evening to present this insight and feedback. I hope it was helpful and that many of you connect with Greg offline to learn more.